Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. In this week's episode, I'm really excited to welcome back Alistair Moes from MooseAngerManagement. Alistair and I discuss the power of language in this episode. We focus on how language can impact our ability to communicate and how different words can have different meanings for people based on their subjective life experiences and interpretations. We also discuss how language is powerful in relationships and how we can use language to enable healthy communication. At the end of the episode, if you could leave a 5-star review, I would truly appreciate it. Well, Alistair, thank you again and welcome back to the podcast. Always great to chat with you. You're, super grateful for you to take the time and have this conversation with me. I really enjoyed the podcast we did previously. I know it took us a couple of tries back then. Hopefully we can get this one done the first time around. But for people that haven't either listened to our episode together from the past or just aren't aware of your work, do you mind kind of quickly going over what it is that you do and where you're based, just for new listeners?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me back. It's always good to talk with you. And I'm in Vancouver. I lead a team of well-experienced counselors, and we the name of the company is MooseAngerManagement, and we run groups, lots of groups. We start new men's groups every 4 weeks, and we see loads of people individually. And I've worked with thousands of people over the years. Last 26 years, I've been running the company, and really enjoy it. Really get inspired by the changes we get to see men make. And we also run women's groups. There's the healinganger.ca is the women's side of the program. My partner runs that. And more women are addressing anger these days than they used to. It's sort of less taboo. But lots of men coming our way, and life is stressful these days. So we certainly see men and work with people all over the world, and have for many years. But certainly with COVID, we're mostly seeing people online. Although I have one guy that works with people individually, and I mean, people come to us because of anger, but there's always all sorts of things behind the anger in general, like, trauma and historic abuse and depression and loss and grief, and the whole range of emotions. And like many people who call us, I did not have good role modeling around emotional intelligence or emotional health growing up, and really had to do a lot of learning myself, because I was pretty emotionally immature, and had to dedicate and continue to many years to learning and growing. And I feel like I'm very appreciative of all the training that I, even though I'm 60 years old, I keep on taking training and learning and growing, and having interesting conversations with people like yourself that are doing good work around the world. So good to be here.
No, I appreciate that, Alistair. And I mean, it always blows my mind when you say 26 years, because when you think about it, you've probably seen a lot of transition and shift in just even people's perspectives on whether it's anger or any form of healing that's related, right? And I think, when you talk about emotional immaturity, I think this is also something we as people are growing and learning over time. Obviously previous generations didn't have that knowledge or awareness, and now we have a little bit more. So that in itself is a journey for a lot of people too, right? And I'm sure you've seen that in the work you do. Yeah,
well, and recently, you can see that society has stepped up just with more maturity and more compassion around, the whole Me Too movement, but more recently, Kyle Beach, the hockey player that, is suing the Chicago Blackhawks and I think the NHL, and how that's being treated now compared to 11 years ago when he first reported things. Now people are listening and acknowledging, and there's so many examples of that out in the world that people aren't just brushing it off to the side or sweeping it under the rug like they used to. And that's true for men and for women. And I just appreciate seeing that people are changing how they talk about these things.
Yeah, and that, I mean, in that example, to your point, it was interesting to see, and also great to see that there's a change in perspective that men can also be abused, and like for Kyle to hold that in for so many years and not even step forward in the public light, it obviously took a lot of courage, but it was just that it wasn't even accepted previously.
Well, and he spoke up because somebody else spoke up.
Yeah.
About the same guy.
Yes.
And I listened to and watched a little bit of hockey.
Yeah.
And played a lot of hockey as a kid. And listening to the sports guys talk about it was really refreshing. Like historically, sports guys were all like, right, drinking and women and just being tough. And the guy that interviewed Kyle Beach, that interview's on TSN.
Yeah,
like it was really good. I mean, it was really compassionate and understanding and supportive. And that just would not have happened that way 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Or 20 years ago. I mean, and so while there's an awful lot of negativity, today is International Men's Day.
Yeah.
And it feels almost like, well, am I allowed to say, Happy International Men's Day? Because men do so many bad things. It's like, probably not going to get a lot of likes on that one, but I think it's important that we acknowledge the courage of men like Kyle Beach and the courage and the way people are standing up for more things, and not obviously just for men, but for the U.S. women's gymnastics team, for what people are doing about the disappearance of this Chinese tennis star right now. People are taking more of an ethical stance on things. And for some reason, there's a guy that runs the International Women's Tennis Federation, or whatever the title is. And they're risking like hundreds of millions of dollars of revenue because a woman disappeared. And historically, that kind of thing didn't happen so much.
Yeah. No, I agree.
And I get to witness men every week in groups and individually who really want to step up for their families. And those guys don't get a lot of airplay, or if they do, they just get negativity around what they have done. And let's face it, we've all made mistakes. Everybody has made mistakes, and we're supposed to. Like we're human beings, and
absolutely
we make mistakes. And so much in plays out on social media where everybody just like dog piles on top of whoever has done something wrong.
Yeah.
And sometimes justifiably so.
Right.
But we lose our humanity when we get into that all or nothing. And so I think it's important that we actually practice compassion and empathy for others, especially those we disagree with.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, we lose our own humanity, and I don't think that does anybody any good.
Yeah. And along the same lines, I think even having that compassion and empathy for ourselves. And, I think you've touched on a lot of great things that are perfect for the conversation I wanted to have with you today around the power of language. And a couple of areas I wanted to explore with you today is language around how we speak to ourselves, and how language in terms of how we speak to others. And you touched on all or nothing, and that's evident even in the ways we speak to our partners, our friends, our family members, and how certain words have a different interpretation for people, and how that could be triggering for someone else, and having that empathy when you recognize that you may have said something that triggered someone else, rather than getting defensive, right? So that's kind of some of the things I wanted to explore with you today. But let's maybe start with even the way we speak to ourselves, right? And and timely enough, last week I read the book 4 Agreements, and the first agreement, for people that don't know, is being impeccable with your word. And when I first read that, I thought, okay, well, initially my thoughts around that was, okay, that means how I speak to others, whether I deliver on my promises. But when I started reading more on that chapter or agreement, I realized that the biggest thing is how I speak to myself. And I wanted to get your thoughts on that, and how, I've noticed too, like, if I speak to myself negatively, it's just, I'm basically creating this narrative, and I'm just carrying this negative energy around. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, a couple of different things come to mind. One is a guy, a really bright, intelligent guy years ago, who came to see me and told me he went for a fair period of time where the first moment of every morning as he woke up, he'd be just opening his eyes up, and he'd say, "Fuck, here's another day." That was the launching pad into his day. And then one day, one morning it occurred to him, this isn't very good. Like, he came up with, and one of the things we talk about is in our groups is creating a goal. And one of the possible goals that quite a few guys work on is about transitions. Mm-hmm. So when you first greet somebody in the morning, perhaps how you first greet yourself, but also that first step, even into a phone call, or when you walk into work, or when you walk back home, or if there's other people at home, that first interaction with them kind of sets a tone. Mm-hmm. And I think, on your point, that first interaction with ourself is so critical. Mm-hmm. And many of the people that come to see me, and I can relate to this at some level, is they came from a family that had a lot of negativity, mm-hmm. a lot of criticism, a lot of judgment. Some of it might have been very subtle. Some of it may have come out in shaming. Some of it may have been like really dramatic. Mm-hmm. But the story around that is that a woman, and years ago I co-facilitated the women's group with a woman co-facilitator for quite a number of years. Yeah. And she came to the group, and she moved here from another country. She moved to Vancouver, and she said, people are really unfriendly here. That was her take on it. And 10 years later, she comes to our anger management group. She attended a couple of times and did some individual sessions as well. And one of the things she started to practice was saying love and light to you. Every time that she noticed that she was criticizing or judging herself or others, or just mm-hmm. things in general, And so she got this quote from a longer quote from Dr. Martin Luther King, and I like to try and get the quote accurate. The longer quote, which you're probably familiar with, is, "Darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that." So this was just shortened down to love and light to you. And
Mm-hmm.
she heard somebody else say that, but she picked it up. And so she practiced this day in and day out because of the amount of negativity in her surroundings that she grew up. It was like that was her default.
Yeah.
So she needed to do a lot of practice.
Mm-hmm.
But she came in, like quite a number of weeks later and said, Vancouver's not such an unfriendly place after all. People are pretty nice here. So that self-talk
Mm-hmm.
creates so much of our lived experience.
Yes.
And it isn't unusual that somebody comes our way that's just so negative and critical that it's like they've gone far down that path where all they see is what's wrong. It's like they're continually triggered.
Mm-hmm.
They're continually elevated.
Mm-hmm.
And we've probably seen lots of people, especially around the pandemic, where people are just like feeling threatened all the time, and all they can see is disaster and mayhem around the world. And well, the news contributes to that.
Mm-hmm.
But I think we start, as you mentioned, with that self-talk, where we need to get to know what we refer to as the inner critic.
Yes.
And know its history.
Mm-hmm.
And acknowledge where it came from, often from our experience with our parents. Not that we're blaming them, because they quite honestly got it from their parents, and so on and so forth. And it's not about blaming, it's about understanding, because it's in your body.
Yeah.
Right? You feel the constriction in your chest, or the feeling, that heavy feeling in your gut or your solar plexus, or however it shows up in your body, the clenching of the jaw.
Mm-hmm.
And we're just elevated up into fight or flight, or at least to the edge of that, maybe.
Yeah.
And we're defensive.
Mm-hmm.
And we're not trusting.
Yeah.
The anxiety's up, and you start every day like that. It's like, which is why I spend like half an hour every morning meditating. And the meditation is just a practice in staying with my breathing really slow, which is a form of self-soothing,
mm-hmm.
just slowing the heart rate down. And so I practice that every morning, and my mind wanders all over the place because I've been running a business for 26 years, among other things.
Yeah.
And so the practice is being compassionate with myself,
mm-hmm.
being kind with myself, and having a bit of a sense of humor about the whole thing, because my mind wanders, and then I bring it back.
Yep.
I make mistakes, so to speak, and then bring it back, but without judgment, without too much self-criticism.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it's like we need to practice this a lot if we were around other things when we were growing up.
Yeah. And
I'm guessing you can relate to some of that.
Oh, absolutely. I think there's an aspect of guilt or shame that we carry too, right? To your point, when we make a mistake, and the default is going to that space of guilt and shame rather than having compassion. And for me, the reason why I can relate it, as you mentioned, is it comes back to being a child and my parents sending me this message that I should know better. So even now, when I make a mistake as a grown man, immediate dialogue that comes in my head is, you should know better. And it's taken a lot of work for me to like really pause at that moment and have compassion for myself and remind myself that, hey, I'm human, I'm figuring it out. If I knew better, I would have done better, but I didn't. And now I do, right? So it's just having that space for yourself where you can tell yourself it's okay to make a mistake, and not just let it linger on for days and walk around with this guilt and shame, because in that space, you're just creating or manifesting that in your life. So it's almost like this cycle that you've now created and you can't get out of it. You continue to make mistakes, you start with the guilt, and then you continue to make mistakes and you keep falling down and down. And so that's been a huge piece of work for me. And then along those lines, in terms of what you said of that self-love and having that kind of space for yourself, is taking care of myself like I would my own child, making proper meals for myself, just being kind, not only with the way I speak to myself, but also how I treat myself physically, and being mindful of those little things.
Yeah, because if you don't treat yourself well, you're a lot less likely to treat others well, or at least, treat others well in a sustainable manner. Because sometimes people are super kind to others and not to themselves, but there's something unsustainable about it.
Correct. Yeah. And the biggest realization for me was also, is if I speak to myself a certain way, I'm basically setting the blueprint for others on how they can speak to me. Right. And if I have this negative dialogue, I'm basically telling others, you can speak to me this way too. And it's funny because when others talk to us that way, we get really upset without recognizing that, well, that's the energy we're putting out there. So that's taken a lot of work and awareness too, in recognizing that, well, I set the bar on how I want to be treated based on how I treat myself.
Yeah. And then you walk through life differently. You hold yourself differently, and you're more likely to face somebody head on, whereas somebody will insult another person and you can see that person's body language just shrink, just collapse. Whereas they don't have to, but that's their default.
Yeah.
Whereas, with some understanding of themselves and some safety, they can learn how to hold themselves upright, be open, and deliver whatever message is important there. Many years ago, my kids were with me, and they had a friend over, and this kid was probably about, I don't know, 13 or 14. And they were sitting at the dinner table, and he just looked at my daughter with this serious look, and he just held it, made her completely uncomfortable. And he was just messing with her. But you could tell he had some ability to have that sort of personal power where he could be solid in himself. And he was just checking it out. And she got all uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Which is, I think if she had a bit more experience with him around that, she would have figured out how to be solid in her response. But not being used to not having familiarity with that, it's like she didn't know what to do with it.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just interesting watching, young teenagers working on stuff like that.
And figuring it out. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think along those lines, like in terms of, we're talking about how we treat ourselves or how we speak to ourselves, and, just in terms of the work you do as well, I think a lot of that anger comes from there too, right? And we just don't know how to pinpoint it. And a lot of it is created by ourselves. And we bottle it up, and then obviously we just don't know how to express it, and it kind of shows up as a form of anger because we just haven't learned that healthy expression. And most of the time people know that it's not what others are doing, it's our own self-created conflict that's bringing that about.
Yeah. And the whole sort of training many of us got growing up about what it means to be a man doesn't include, listening and compassion and empathy. And I had a guy call me up the other day, and like, I don't take these things I don't personalize them.
Yeah.
He was one angry guy. Like, he was upset at the world. And I didn't expect him to follow through, and I'm pretty sure he won't. But he was upset because these kids ride their bicycles up and down a sidewalk. And personally, I have to hold back my humor.
Yeah.
I use a fair bit of humor. And for him, he was so upset about so many things that he had absolutely no control over.
Mm-hmm.
Like, who moves into the city, who lives in the city, right? You can hear a little bit of racism behind it.
Yeah.
Maybe a lot of racism, but and then that people are doing what they're not supposed to do. People aren't following the rules. And he actually sounds like he's really a nice guy.
Yeah.
He does things for his neighbors. He's out raking the leaves. He's doing his neighbor's house. But he gets so wrapped up in all these things that he has no control over. So he has this negative thing going on about how terrible society is and how awful everything is. And yeah, you can get swept up in that, but it's completely counterproductive. Because by the end of it, he's like, well, I'm just never going to rake my leaves again. And, if I have to pay for this, because he thought our services were free and they're not. And if I have to pay for this, well, I'll just go to jail then. Right? And it's like, okay, this is completely irrational.
Yeah.
You should probably talk to the guy at a different time, because he's so swept up in the, this is unfair.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when you think about it, like, how old are you when you're saying that's not fair?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Like, kids, when they're 6 or 7, like to use that terminology.
Yeah. Yeah.
And and I could tell he actually did have a heart in there, but he wasn't able to connect to his intelligence and his heart. And he was just completely in survival mode.
Mm-hmm.
So I can have some compassion for that. And I can even see a bit of humor in how he's like it's so childish in the way he's reacting.
Right.
I don't let any of that out for him, because he's not ready for that yet.
Yeah. Yeah.
But, I'm working with a couple the other day, and, and I tell them about what my wife and I do, which is sometimes, because I'm not perfect, even if I've done this for 26 years, I'll be doing or saying something, and she'll say, how old are you right now?
Yeah.
I'll go, 4.
Yeah.
It's like, I'm not really at my peak best maturity level.
Yeah.
And we'll have a laugh about it. And I don't have to get all defensive about it.
Yeah.
Because I make mistakes.
Yeah.
I'm imperfect, and I'm not seeking perfection.
Right.
I'm seeking growth and learning. And that guy that I was on the phone with, not quite ready for the learning.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I feel bad for him. And I think I might send him another text just with a link to the arousal cycle, which is on the angerman.ca website.
Yeah.
there's a bunch of videos there on the resources page, but one of them shows all the physiology that happens as we escalate,
Mm-hmm.
and what happens in your body and in your brain, and the blood flows and the hormones, and it explains all of this so that people recognize this is so physiological. This is so much about our nervous system that if we can take time, as I do every morning, to calm the nervous system, to be connected to it, it gives us a better ability to step back and notice. We're more likely, because we practiced noticing, wow, I feel this constriction in my chest, or my cheeks are flushed, or I can feel the heat rising up into my head, or I just noticed that I blamed somebody else, or that I'm being all defensive, or whatever it is. Because if we can notice these things, then we can change that dialogue in our head.
Absolutely.
Change what we're doing with our own physiology. And work with it just more intelligently.
Yeah.
But we have to be able to notice this stuff. And I grew up learning just to numb and ignore and pretend like everything was fine when it wasn't, or just blow up and lose it.
Yeah.
Which wasn't very effective.
No. And I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned like this person you've been talking to, that, you know, we all kind of have to go through our own journey. And for some people, it just takes a little longer. Right. And one of the things, like when my friends are in that state where they're just complaining or blaming everyone, you know, I just ask them a simple question, and they don't always appreciate it because they're not ready to accept it yet. But I'm like, are you mad at the situation or other people, or more with yourself? And if you're angry with yourself in those situations, you really need to understand why. And, you know, quite often, like, you know, in that example, people will do something nice for someone, and when then they create this expectation in their mind that they should get something in return, even if it's a thank you. And when they don't get that thank you, they get extremely angry and upset. And, you know, and that's where I challenge my friends. I'll be like, well, are you angry with this person, or are you angry with yourself for setting yourself up for failure by having an expectation? So, and, you know, often they'll tell me to take a hike, but sometimes when they're ready, they're willing to really reflect on that and kind of understand where is this coming from?
Yeah, maybe not right in the moment, but sometime the next day or the next week or the next month, even, who knows?
Yeah. I mean, I know, like, most of the time when I get upset about a situation, it has more to do with me than anything else going around me, whether it's another person or it's just an outcome that I wasn't expecting or didn't want. And I think that's, you know, a lot of that anger or resentment comes for ourselves rather than anything else around us.
Yeah, especially when things surprise us, when we're not prepared, the unexpected. Yeah, which, you know, it seems like the world is a little less predictable these days.
Yeah.
Whether it's about you know, the weather and climate change and floods and mudslides, or it's about an ever-changing pandemic around the world, or whatever else it might be.
Yeah.
Change continues to happen, it seems, at a substantial rate, and we have to take the time to slow down. And I think that's one of the biggest things that guys get, is that they learn to pause, which sounds simple, but it's not. Taking that pause can be one of the hardest things. Taking that pause and doing something different than you may have done can take a tremendous amount of effort and courage to try something different. But, you know, we need to get out of our comfort zone.
Yeah. Well, I obviously, like you said, it's definitely hard, and that's why you've been in business for so long. If it was easy, then you wouldn't be in
Everybody
business.
would do it.
Yeah.
That's right. And
Yeah.
business is pretty good.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, kind of shifting over to the other part of like, in terms of language, and you touched on it earlier, all or nothing thinking, and a lot of that is evident even in our language, right? Where, and you and I talked about this in our last podcast episode, where even with our partners, where we're saying, hey, you always do this, or you never do this. And one of the other things I wanted to also touch on was, you know especially in the culture and society we live in, like, there's so many things that are open to interpretation, and even our perspective on words are so unique and different, right? And one of the things I found, like, just even using the word trauma, if I said, oh, that was traumatizing for me, I find often people get very triggered because they either feel like I'm minimizing their trauma, or they don't agree with what I'm defining as traumatic. And it's, what I wanted to explore around this was, a lot of things happen to us, and we all have different experiences in life, big or small, but our perspectives are so unique, and that's what makes things, I think, interesting. Otherwise, if we had very similar views on things, the world would be a very boring place. So I don't know what your thoughts are on the whole aspect of language when we talk to other people.
Yeah, well, and the more reactive, right? The less dialogue, and the more monologue seems to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And you certainly see that in social media, where if you follow some thread down, people are just repeating themselves, or maybe getting more extreme in how they're repeating themselves, but there's no dialogue.
Yeah.
There's nothing going on there. So people are completely closed.
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking about that this morning, how challenge yourself to really be compassionate and use empathy with the next person that you disagree with.
Mm-hmm.
Like, really put yourself in their shoes. Try to figure out what it's like to be them,
Mm-hmm.
which really connects you with their humanity,
Mm-hmm.
and their pain, and their sadness,
Mm-hmm.
and their passion, all of these things.
Yeah.
And then you risk learning something, but there's so much going on where people are just practicing not doing that. And if somebody steps out of line, especially somebody who has a big following, or a celebrity, they say the wrong thing, and everybody's just jumping all over them like it's the end of the world. And it's like, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
This is like, is anybody going to die because this guy said he instead of she, or they, or whatever it might be, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, for me, even saying that he, she, or they, I'm like, oh man, am I in trouble now? Yeah, I feel a little constriction, like I'm not supposed to, use an example like that, because it's like, well, is that going to create a big issue?
Yeah.
I mean, probably not, but the wrong person says that in the wrong place in the wrong time, and they're going to have people piling on
Mm-hmm.
that they shouldn't be making light of that. And
Yeah.
I'm not making light of it. It's just, nobody's going to die because I said that.
Mm-hmm.
And so if people are responding as if somebody's going to die, as if it's the end of the world,
Mm-hmm.
it's like, all right, well, what's going on there? Probably, if you look into that person, there is some trauma in there,
Mm-hmm.
because it's like somebody just pushed a button that happens to be like a hot piece of coal,
Yeah.
right? And they just pushed right into their skin, and they're blowing up like it's the end of the world. And I don't have to be personalizing that.
Mm-hmm.
If anything, I can have some understanding. And if the person's willing at some point down, after a period of time has passed, to have dialogue, totally open for it.
Mm-hmm.
And if they're not, I'm okay not to. Right. But yeah, like I saw somebody say that as a response to somebody. Basically, somebody was getting really, really irate.
Mm-hmm.
Is anybody going to die right now? Is anybody going to die? Like, really seriously.
Yeah.
Like, well, no. Okay, good.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's like just making sure.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, that's probably not the right thing to say most of the time with most people. But, it's like we need to check things out.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think part of the problem I'm seeing is there's such a divide in pretty much everything now, right? Like, and the most recent thing is that should I get the vaccine or should I not get the vaccine? And then you almost get, kind of like kicked out of society for having a certain view on things and expressing that view. Meanwhile, we talk about freedom of speech or freedom of expression, and then you're kind of feeling like scared to even express yourself because you're worried about the backlash that may come with it. And one of the things I feel like people are very, like, they're so stuck to their opinions that they're not even willing to see that maybe there's another opinion out there that could also be right. And one of the things I try to practice myself, and it's hard, but understanding that I have an opinion and a perspective on things because of my life experiences, because of how I've been raised or the culture I grew up in. But that doesn't mean that's the only opinion that needs to exist. There's other equally valuable opinions that I could learn from if I just put my ego on the side and just maintained humility and remind myself that I could also learn from others.
Yeah, and it's good. Like, personally, I think it's good that people are making their own decisions around these things.
Yeah.
Like, we're not forcing people to make certain decisions, but it's when people get so outraged that this is, people should be doing this, right? And whenever people use the word should, there's a lot of judgment and often shaming going along with it.
Mm-hmm.
And whether you're pro or against, whatever, right? It's like, do we have to force our view on other people? I don't think so.
Mm-hmm.
That's where we lose ourselves.
Yeah.
And and people will say things like, well, it's the principle of it. I go, well, is the principle more important than being kind, being caring about other people as if they are people? And sometimes a parent, a father or a mother will, get so connected, wound up in the principle that they forget that actually the relationship is a lot more important than whatever the principle is.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So people lose themselves. And I think that's part of what happens when people come and see us is we work on connecting them with who they are at their core.
Mm-hmm.
Because at people's core, there's usually some space for loving connection with other people.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And at their core, there's also usually this scared little kid who's afraid that he's going to die if this or this doesn't happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Right. So if nobody listens to me, then it actually, that part of him does feel like the end of the world, and it does feel like he's going to die.
Mm-hmm.
Except that's just one part of him. That's not his whole being.
Right.
And he needs to relate differently to himself so that he can alter that relationship so he can act with more maturity.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But and promoting compassion and empathy and people being true to themselves doesn't get a lot of airplay. Right? It's not
No.
a disaster.
No. Yeah.
Right? The disasters and the hatred gets a lot more time on the news,
Mm-hmm.
and so then I think it's easy for people to start thinking, well, it's worse than it's ever been, and that society is going to hell. And
Yeah.
and I also think, well, it also may be the safest time in the history of human beings' existence on this planet. At least where I live, walking around North Vancouver, it's pretty darn safe.
Yeah.
I mean, it's safe.
Yeah.
And I've
Yeah.
traveled to a lot of countries in the world where it doesn't always feel safe to walk the streets.
Yeah. I agree.
But also, knock on wood, nothing real as bad has ever happened to me.
Yeah. Yeah.
Spending a lot of time in a lot of different countries. So we can focus on that. And I think that's also why I live right beside trails. And basically you could walk as long as you wanted to walk on these trails.
Yeah.
Like they literally, they go on forever. And that helps.
Yeah.
That's healing for me.
For sure.
If that, if somebody asked me, do you go to a church? I go, yeah, a lot of trees in that church.
Yeah.
And it's organized by trees and by nature.
Yeah.
Not by people.
Yeah. No, it's important to find that space of where you can feel comfortable and heal, right? And a lot of the times I get that same feeling in nature. But like,
so can I ask you, what
yeah.
do you do around your self-talk? Like, how do you observe it, and what do you do with it, just on a daily basis?
I mean, it's not easy, and one of the things I struggle with is consistency. But I've really had to reframe my inner dialogue, and one of the things that worked for me is starting with positive affirmations, and basically anything or any beliefs I had about myself, which often exists on a subconscious level, right? And anytime something happens, whether it's with your partner or your friends, you get triggered. And the reason why I found I was getting triggered was because of these limiting beliefs I had on a subconscious level. So for me, in order to rewire all of that, I had to start with positive affirmations that changed or reframed those beliefs I had. So one of the biggest ones was, I'm not good enough. So it's reminding myself that I am worthy of good things and I am worthy of love wherever I go. And that really helped me reprogram things. And now it's at a point where whenever I feel guilt or shame, or I catch myself speaking negatively to myself, is pausing and reminding myself of what it is I am doing and what my purpose is. And my purpose is to really be a human, make mistakes, grow, learn. And yeah, if I keep repeating the same mistakes over and over again, then there is a problem there. But if I'm making a mistake and I'm telling myself, okay, even if I can improve 1% next time, that is growth. And to your point, I think a lot of it has to come with compassion and empathy for ourselves. Otherwise, you just carry that shame around all the time. And tying the two together by being able to hold that space for myself, when I hear other people say things that I may not agree with, or they may say something I find offensive, it's not personalizing it, but having compassion and empathy for them as well, and reminding myself that there is something going on with them that needs healing. Otherwise, they wouldn't say things like that. So so it's tying the two together in terms of just language, and even when other people say things that could be offensive or I may not agree with, it's having that compassion around, well, their life experiences have been different. They've gone through different things, maybe more traumatic things. I don't know that. I've never been in their shoes. So it's having that compassion for everyone, right? And it starts with yourself.
Yeah, yeah. And so a lot of the work that I did, because I can relate to that whole I'm not good enough, which I think occurs, usually starts in us when we're little. And sometimes it's passed down to us from our parents or grandparents. And then sometimes things happen in life. Like for me, we were living in South America in the 60s, and my older brother and I were sent off to live in Holland with an aunt and uncle. And that was one of the things I got out of that as a 4-year-old was, I don't know what I did wrong, but I better not do that again.
Yeah.
Right. And so there's this trepidation that came into me that I had to slow everything down and really think things through before doing things, or it was like I was afraid to make mistakes, afraid to disappoint somebody. And that comes from, I'm not good enough. I'm not trustworthy. Because as a little kid, we're egocentric. Everything that happens around us, we interpret it as about us. And that's true for good things as well. A lot of good things happen. You're like, hey, right, this is great.
And I think we do that as adults too, right? Like we are so in our heads that anything we personalize it if we haven't really done the work.
Yeah. And it's important to connect with that younger part in us and really learn how to relate to it and to recognize what its needs are and how to provide for those needs. So if I'm feeling this toxic shame in me, it's important that I allow myself to really feel that, which usually happens in the core of the body. For me, in my solar plexus, there's a heaviness to it, and I need to take the time to soothe myself, to be kind to myself, to remind myself it's okay.
Yeah,
it's not really the end of the world. Like we're going traveling tomorrow to the US, and and I had to take a COVID test. And we got these things that you can do at home and do it online. And the amount of anxiety I had in me as I was doing this thing that I'd never done before.
Yeah.
That I was, it was like I get brain fog and I'm trying to figure stuff out, which, clearly I'm pretty good at. I've run a business for 26 years. I'm, what have you. But in those moments, I felt my stress level was really elevated. I had to really whoa, this is not the end of the world here. I'm just doing something. Even if it doesn't work, I can figure something else out. But, this going into the unknown, doing something I haven't done before.
Yeah.
Around COVID, which is so loaded these days, I was like, holy cow, I'm stressed.
Well, and I think there was probably a fear too, right? If you mess things up, you might not be able to go on this trip.
And that would really suck. Yeah. And so even when you've done a lot of work around it, these things still rise up in the body.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I deal with it better now than I did 5 or 10 or 20 years ago, but I'm still human.
Yeah.
It's just like, and so I think what you're doing, which is talking about how you talk to yourself, it makes such a big difference, whether it's about positive sort of self-talk or A lot of people find taking the time to write down a few things that they're grateful for every morning.
Yep.
It connects us to something bigger. We have to use our intelligence to figure it out, and we have to be connected to our heart.
Yeah.
And so if we're doing things that encourage this within us, hey, and it's just that the world is better off with more people doing that.
Absolutely.
In my opinion, anyway.
No, I agree with you 100%. And I think it's really about reframing, right? And I've done that whole gratitude journal thing too. And it shifted my mindset significantly. And it actually made a huge difference because, now instead of picking up on the negativity around you, you're programming your brain to pick up on the positivity. And that alone, like as we mentioned earlier, starting your day off that way, just picking up on positivity or even speaking to yourself positively sets the stage for your entire day or your week. And if you do that on a consistent basis, you're only setting yourself up for success. And when those low points happen during the day, you're able to, instead of sit in that shame, you're able to like get out of it really quickly and move on.
Well, and it's expansive, right?
Yes.
So it's not just about being positive. It's about opening up to all the possibilities that are in front of you.
Absolutely.
In a healthy way. And I think being really connected to our own physiology, like being aware of what's happening in your body, and practicing just, doing things like yoga and stretching and what have you. So we actually physically open up the body.
Yeah. So
because all of these things are, overlap. They're all working together.
Yeah.
And we want to be open up so that we're taking our time responding to the difficulties in life, and we become better listeners. And when people do that, they, the relationships around them generally improve. And that leads to more success at home, more success in business, and whatever you do. And as a boy growing up, I didn't get taught how to have healthy relationships.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like my parents did not have a healthy relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you guys graduate from high school, I'm divorcing him. That's not really like.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have an older brother, who the day after his youngest graduated from high school, he moved out.
Yeah.
And I said to him, I don't have any fear, he'll never listen to any of this. I said to him, so, what was it like when you moved out? Like, it must have been hard knowing that your kids are having a hard time. And how are you feeling? He goes, I feel great. Feel fantastic. And, do you think the fact that mom said this and that you left like the day after your youngest graduated, do you think that has any role to play here? He's like, it's ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I'm not there to argue with him, right? I was just like throwing out a suggestion.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, it's like, it's okay that he's not open to that idea.
Right.
I'm not attached to it being right. Do I believe it? Yes, absolutely. I believe that has an impact, and you can see it all over families.
Yes.
Where similar things happen. My ex-wife, her mother got pregnant at 16 with her. It wasn't a planned thing. And my mom also, I didn't learn this till I was 40, also got pregnant at 16. And, so she and I were drawn together, not in a healthy way, but we were drawn together. And those types of stories happened throughout lots of families.
Oh yeah. And I mean, that's a separate topic on its own, but generational trauma is real. And if you don't do the work or heal it, it just carries on. And like, in the story you mentioned about your brother too, he's probably carried that dialogue his whole life, and he eventually ended up living it out. And obviously he's not aware of it, and most people aren't. They repeat the same patterns, seldom really paying attention to it, right? So
it's uncomfortable stuff to look at.
Yeah. But Alistair, again, I want to thank you so much for your time and having this conversation with me. And I'm sure you've got lots to do before you take off tomorrow. But just before we end, I know you mentioned your website and your Instagram page, but for listeners who want to find you, do you mind sharing some of the ways that they can reach out to you, whether it's even joining some of your group sessions? What are some of the best ways?
Well, we start groups every 4 weeks, and you can attend from anywhere where in the world that has a good internet connection. And angerman.ca or angerman.online. The women's one is healinganger.ca. We have a book titled Lose Your Temper for Men or Healing Anger for Women, which is available through the websites on the shop page. You can also sign up for the groups on the shop page, and Moose Anger Management on Instagram, on Facebook, Lose Your Temper on Twitter, what have you. And I answer my phone. So my phone is all over the place. If you go to the website, it's there. If you have any questions at all, phone, text, email, happy to talk with people about this. And thank you for the conversation today.
Yeah, no, you're welcome. I really enjoyed it, and I hope listeners can get something out of it. And it was a topic I wanted to cover, and when I thought about it, you're the first person that jumped to mind. So I'm glad you were able to make yourself available.
Yeah, pleasure's all mine. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for tuning in to another episode. As always, please subscribe to the podcast if you enjoy the episodes, or leave a comment in the comment section. I always love hearing from you. Thank you again, and until next week.